Sugarcane is focused on one of the 139 federally funded residential schools in Canada. But myself, being a member of a formerly colonized people, I feel that your film also shines a spotlight on European colonialism in general. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how you feel we, as colonized and formerly colonized peoples, approach the violence perpetrated on us by European imperialists. And I'd like to provide some context. So, in settler nations like Canada and the US, the lands of First Peoples were misappropriated and the peoples themselves were systematically traumatized and in many cases annihilated. On the other hand, in formerly colonized parts of the world like India, through the European imperialist policy of divide and conquer, fissures were created and deepened, sowing disunity and turmoil. For example, before leaving India, the British caused and oversaw in 1905 the first partition along religious lines of Bengal, the place of my ancestors. And then in 1947, the British orchestrated a permanent partition of India, again of Bengal and also of Punjab, dividing us into three parts, based once more along religious lines. I read some accounts of over 6 million Indians dying in less than 1 year as they were displaced during the partition of India, which at the time had a population of about 390 million. That's roughly the current population of North America. My grandfather witnessed this massacre when our people were fighting to eject the British imperialists, and he related this trauma to me. So I come back to my question, what do we do, um, and allies, I guess, as formerly and still colonized peoples when faced with the permanence and what seems to be irreversibility of these types of destruction by Europeans who enrich themselves at our expense? What is the path forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sugarcane is in part not just about the violence perpetrated against Indigenous children and families by colonial institutions, but also the cycles of violence and other forms of suffering that resulted because of that violence, which I think is, in some instances, a harder conversation to have. On the one hand, there are obvious and gross injustices that remain largely unknown and in almost every instance unaccounted for, in terms of any form of justice for Native people and survivors and their families. And I think that's true across the colonized world. I mean, in what sense did the United Kingdom or the British Empire ever, uh, you know, give anything back for the violence wrought by, partition and years of imperialism? And yet, I think that there's a second part of this, which is that, and I think that we do this in a very intimate way through my family story in Sugarcane, which is, that the history of family separation, of denying parents the right to raise their own children, had obvious and very painful implications for my father's life, which then had implications for my own life. And so I think there's a second question here, which is, and this is something that is discussed across, post-colonial literature from Fanon to, many others, which is, in what ways did we as the colonized people internalize elements of, the colonial violence? And I think that, that raises in many instances questions that are sometimes less black and white than, what are the wrongs that the colonizer did to us, and what do they owe us, and how have they not been held to account for that? I think that it raises questions of how do we heal amongst ourselves as colonized peoples, as Indigenous peoples, within our own communities, often within our own families. And then I also think it raises questions about, what are the legacies of this history in present day, society and social relations. For example, at the tail end of making sugarcane, I've been spending a lot of time in Surrey, British Columbia, which is a vastly majority South Asian suburb of Vancouver with one of the largest urban native populations in Canada. So, there are a bunch of kids who live there who are the intergenerational survivors of these schools who are living, with many of the harms and traumas that can be traced back to this history. And also, they are living in a context wherein, you brought up, the Punjab, wherein there are people who have migrated and been displaced in part because of the long legacy of British imperialism on the subcontinent. And, where just a couple years ago, the Indian state tried to assassinate and successfully did assassinate a Sikh activist, which is part of that whole history of British imperialism, but also, I think asks hard questions, should lead us to ask hard questions about what are the legacies of this within our own politics and our own societies. And I think that a lot of that has to do with how not only do we relate to our own families and communities, but also how do we relate to each other across difference. I think that a big part of this legacy, one that is obviously troubling many societies across the world today, is how do we treat indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities, and what is our tolerance for those kinds of differences. And are there certain elements of our policies that are still geared towards, assimilating and erasing those differences? And while we were working on Sugarcane, I happened to read an article in a great magazine called Caravan, about schools that to me looked and sounded an awful lot like the ones that you learn about in Sugarcane, that are still presently operating in India, that are impacting religious and ethnic minorities there who are being subjected to a similar policy of education-based assimilation that is attacking their culture and their community structure and their family structure.
Uh, yeah, I'll just add to that that I think that there are questions about, what is owed to communities who have suffered through these types of colonization. Conversations about reparations. Does the Catholic Church, for instance, have a duty to pay victims for the harms that they caused? The Canadian government, for instance, settled many cases and did pay out victims of the residential schools. The U.S. government, of course, has not done the same. I think there's a question of restoring language and culture that was, so systematically eradicated. Does society and government have a responsibility to kind of replenish what was depleted in a way? And how can we mobilize around those things? Obviously, we're in a political climate, particularly in the United States right now, where none of that is going to happen, despite a bill that was going through the Senate to start a truth commission here in the U.S. But that kind of brings me to the question of acknowledgement. Is acknowledgement important? Is it a first step? We watched a lots of different kinds of acknowledgement from the Pope, from former President Joe Biden, from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and some of that is meaningful to a lot of people. And then what? Um, and I think there's one other piece of this that I think is interesting. That when Julian was speaking about uh, how do different peoples, different minorities who have um, been subjugated to wrongdoing interact with one another. And there was a really interesting conversation. We screened Sugarcane at Harvard, and there was a conference kind of happening of folks from different countries who had all experienced different forms of truth and reconciliation processes, from South Africa to Rwanda, to Ireland, Northern Ireland. Um, And there was this question about acknowledgement. Um, someone said, I think land acknowledgements are really great, and some as a form of recognition of what was taken. And then someone said, well, why should we just acknowledge, the folks who the land was taken from, Native people, when we don't acknowledge who built the buildings that we're in, meaning Black slaves. And that was a Black professor in the room. And then another guy put his hand up who was from Rwanda and said, well, why would we acknowledge, um, who built the buildings when we don't acknowledge where it is that they were taken from in Africa? And it became this very interesting moment of this kind of scarcity, of resources and ability to claim, entitlement to some sort of acknowledgement and reparations. And it was just an observation I had in that moment of, what it would it look like for groups to work with one another in opposition to a larger, largely white, male driven society, where the levers of power in government and industry and finance are, held largely by white men. And so, and because there's so little space for anyone else, it almost feels like minorities have to compete with one another for that acknowledgement, for reparations, for some sort of truth process. There was this kind of massive movement in the US to acknowledge 1619 as the founding of America, when slavery began. And one thing that missed was the Native American people, the indigenous people of this country that weren't included in that narrative. And so that is something that I think is really interesting, and just brings up questions of how can people work together across groups to demand, some sort of, whether it's reparations or acknowledgement from those systems of power.